you. So we'll start off with a few questions from me before I open it up to the audience, so get your thinking caps on. So I want to start to talking about Small Great Things, because I'm sure everyone else has questions about all of your other books. This is an incredibly powerful and timely book, more than anything. What first gave you the idea to focus on the issues that you do?
So first of all, let me apologize to all of you. As you can hear, I don't have much of a voice anymore. Your country has broken me. So Small Great Things actually came out of a desire to write about racism in the US that I had 25 years ago. I was living in New York City, and there was a story about an African-American undercover cop who had been shot 4 times in the back by white colleagues. I wanted to center that at the heart of a novel, and I tried, and I failed miserably. I couldn't seem to create authentic voices, authentic characters, authentic situations. And to be honest, I really questioned whether I even had the right to. I am very clearly a white woman. I grew up in privilege. What was I going to contribute to a conversation about racism? So I put the book aside, and I kept coming back to it over the years and playing devil's advocate. I would say things like, okay, you write all the time in the point of view of people that you're not. You write as school shooters, you write as Holocaust survivors, you write as men. You're none of those things either. So why was this different? Well, because race is different, racism is different. It's very hard for us to talk about without offending people. And so as a result, we often just don't talk about it at all. So fast forward to 2012, I came across yet another news story, this one out of Flint, Michigan. An African-American nurse with 20 years of experience in a labor and delivery ward helped deliver a baby. And in the aftermath, the father of the baby called in her supervisor. And he said, "I don't want her or anyone who looks like her to touch my kid." He pushed up his sleeve to reveal a swastika tattoo. The hospital put a note in the baby's file saying no African-American personnel to touch this infant. The nurse sued the hospital. She settled out of court. I hope she got a lot of money. But it made me wonder, what if things had gone a little differently? And what if I could center this at the heart of a novel and also push the envelope? What if that nurse had been the only one alone with a kid when something went wrong, and she had to choose between following her supervisor's orders or saving a baby's life? What if, as a result of that, she wound up on trial, defended by a white public defender, a lawyer who, like me, like a lot of my friends, would never consider herself to be a racist? What if I could tell the story from the point of view of the African-American nurse, the white public defender, and the white supremacist father, as they all began to unravel their beliefs about power and privilege and race? And suddenly I knew I was going to finish this book. And it was because 2 things had changed dramatically. I had changed my focus, and I had changed my audience. I wasn't writing a book to tell people of color what their lives are like. That's never going to be my story to tell. I was writing to tell people who look like me, people with light skin, that although it's easy for us to point to a white supremacist and say, "Oh, that's a racist," it's very hard for us to point to ourselves and say the same thing. And yet, racism is not just about prejudice. It's also about power. And in the US, in the UK, if you look like me, you have all the power.
So just picking up on that, was it quite a revelatory experience then, writing this and going through the process to reveal your own internal microaggressions or racism that you didn't even know that we as white people
100%.
experience on a day-to-day?
Because I am not as young as all of you. Perhaps you can tell. And, although my kids all went to college and they had social justice classes, we never had that when I was growing up. And I really thought of myself as a very liberal, open-minded person, with friends from all walks of life. I did not think of myself as a racist. But I couldn't ask all of my readers to unpack their biases unless I had done it myself. So I started by reading everything I could by racial justice educators because I didn't have a vocabulary to have this conversation. And after that, I enrolled in a racial justice workshop thinking, how bad could this possibly be? And I left in tears every single night. And it was mostly because of the stories that I was really hearing for the first time. The Asian American woman who stood up visibly in tears saying that she had a love-hate affair with eyeliner because she couldn't put it on her features very easily, but it was the standard of beauty she'd grown up with in America. Or the African-American woman who said every time she walks out the door, she has to put on a metaphorical mask so that she can be the kind of black woman other people can handle. And I never had to think about any of those things. I never will have to think about any of those things. When I then realized that I was going to be creating voices that were other from mine, I had to figure out how to do it with sensitivity and with empathy. And part of that involved gathering 10 women of color to talk to me for over 100 hours of interview tape. And again, it was not just their hopes and their fears and their failures and their successes, but their stories that rattled me very personally. There was the young African-American mom who came in with the world's cutest baby on her hip. She came in the day after there was a shooting of another African-American unarmed man by the police, and she was hysterical. And she said, how do I do it? How do I keep my son safe when he grows up? How do I teach him to not be black? That was devastating. I have kids your age. They do stupid things occasionally. If they did a stupid thing and were pulled over by the cops, they would be ticketed. They would be arrested. I have never once assumed they would be shot. There was the young girl who had graduated from Vassar College who carried her Vassar water bottle everywhere with her so that on public transportation, she could face it out so the word Vassar was on the aisle. And that way, when white people walked by, they would know she was safe to sit with. There was the African-American mom who said to me, hey, how often do you talk to your kids about racism? And I said, when something happens in the news. And she said, I talk about it every night. It's a matter of life and death. I had spent 50 years of my life not talking about racism because I don't have to. But until I started writing this book, I did not realize what an enormous privilege that is.
So turning that on its head a little bit then, how was the experience of writing from the masculine white supremacist perspective from Turk? Because reading the character, the words he uses to talk about people of colour
are disgusting.
And how was it? How was that experience?
So it was a horrible experience as a writer. Every time I wrote Turk, I would go downstairs and take a shower because I felt dirty. I hated that I could slip into his head and start typing, and after a few minutes, I could type the N-word and I didn't even go like that. I just hated who he made me become. But again, that was another voice that was other to me. And so I had to do that research too. I met with 2 former white supremacists who have since left the movement. The first was a guy named Tim Zoll. He grew up in a very privileged family in Orange County, California, and in the 80s he ran with a very violent skinhead crew. One night he and his buddies went out wilding and they beat up a gay man because he was gay, and they left him bleeding in the street expecting him to die. Years later, he wound up getting out of the movement for a variety of reasons. One of the first things he did was to write a letter to the head of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a rabbi who runs this Center for Tolerance in LA. And he did it because at one point he had written the guy a very offensive email and he wanted to apologize. So the rabbi wrote him back and said, why don't you come work for me? And he did. And he went every day to talk about hate and living a life of hate. And then one day he was in the cafeteria and he looked up and there was a docent leading a tour group through the Wiesenthal Center, and it was the man that he had beaten up and left to die in the street. Their eyes met. Over a period of months, there was an apology, there was forgiveness. They rebuilt a relationship. They're actually friends now. They spend holidays at each other's houses, and every day they stand up together talking about their story. The other guy I spoke with was a guy named Frankie Mink. He ran a very violent crew in Philadelphia of skinheads. At one point, like many skinheads, he went to jail. And when he was in jail, he expected to have a lot in common with other white supremacists. But he really didn't. He got along better with the African-American kids. They would talk about the girls and the food that they missed on the outside, and they would go to Bible study together. And when he got out of jail, his first job was to work for a Jewish man. He had been told his whole life, Jewish people will cheat you out of everything they owe you. So the day before his contract ended, he was called into the boss's office. And he's sitting there going, here it comes, I'm going to get stiffed on my salary. And the boss said to him, Frankie, you've done such a remarkable job. I'd like to pay you double what I contracted you. And Frankie began to realize, how many exceptions to the rule do there have to be before maybe the rules need to change? Both of these men told me how skinheads and white supremacy has changed. Nowadays, you're not going to see these guys with their shaved heads and their Doc Martens going around beating up people in the street. Skinheads look like you and me. They spend most of their time online trying to incite fear and rage and hate through online posts and social media. They also said that in the rural areas of America, like where I live in New Hampshire, white supremacists are still stockpiling weapons for a coming racial holy war that they think will be here soon. In the summertime and the spring, they have these big festivals. You can go to a Hitler's birthday celebration or Aryan Independence Day. And at these festivals, you pitch a tent, listen to white power bands, get a tattoo, and you can bring your kids. There are kiddie games like Pin the Star on the Jew, or a piñata that's an African-American man hanging from a noose. There's target shooting, and the targets are profiles of President Obama or Martin Luther King Jr. It's 2016. Someone's making these materials for use in my country today.
It's just shocking to think, isn't it?
It's horrific.
So I want to move on to talk. So within the novel, there is kind of every character you could imagine when needing to talk about race. There's the Ruth and the Edison, the people of colour who, like you said, put on a mask each day. There's people like Adisa, who's very empowered in her blackness. There's the white supremacist. There's Kennedy, who's white, who, like you said, feels that racism isn't a thing. How aware were you of trying to fill those spaces and fill those molds writing for a white audience?
So aware of it. And it's really interesting because I think people of color, you know, I know what people of color think. I've had unbelievable responses to this book from both white people and people of color. And I have to tell you, I was expecting more pushback from people of color than I actually got. I actually have yet to get a confrontational note or response from a person of color. What they tend to say is, wow, this felt like me. You did your homework, you listened to us, and I'm really glad you started this conversation, some permutation of that. And then they usually tell me a story about a microaggression that they faced. So for example, there was the African-American sign language interpreter whose job it was to go to a white church and to sit across from the front row and to interpret. And an elderly white lady said very loudly, "Can you make her stop? I can't look at her black face anymore." And she had to sign that because that was her job. And then she had to go home and come back the next day and do it all over again. And, you know, we as white people will rarely face that kind of experience. You know, the reason all those people are in there, all those types, and I wouldn't call them types actually because they're not stereotypes. You know, Adisa is not an angry black woman, but if you are not very enlightened, that's how you're going to see her. And then as you begin to peel back the onion layers of her character, you realize she is really smart. She knows how to make the system work to her advantage. She is the first person there for her sister when her sister stumbles and falls. There are a lot of layers to her. You get somebody like Edison, who is Ruth's son, who's my favorite character in the book. And one of the first things Edison says, he listens to his mom on the phone, and he says, "You were talking to a white person." And she goes, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, your voice is different when you talk to someone white." You know, so he calls her out on it. But he also is trying really hard to reconcile the fact that his mom made decisions in what was supposed to be his best interest, which meant moving to a very white community, making friends with mostly white kids, going to an elite private school, doing all of these things in the hopes that he's going to get the best education and the best leg up that he can. And yet, as a result of that, he doesn't really fit in with his black cousins very well. And he also has hit a wall in the white community, because it's one thing to be everyone's buddy, but when you want to date your best friend's sister, that's not cool. And every person of color I talked to had a story like that.
So moving on with like the idea of people educating themselves, I found it really interesting that you had a bibliography in the back of the book, as if suggested reading to say to people that I can't teach you everything about racism, but here's a chance, here's me laying my cards on the table to educate yourself. Did you feel a motivation to do that, a need to do that?
Oh yeah, I mean, any tools that you can give people to talk about racism are incredibly important, first of all, because really the vast majority of white people are not white supremacists, thank God. You know, they're just people who are terrified of saying the wrong thing. And so they don't say anything. And what a community of color hears in that silence is, wow, you don't even care enough to engage. You know, so there's this huge schism between these two communities, that anything you can give that's going to make a bridge is important. Also, and most importantly, you know, my job as a white ally is to talk to the people who look like me. That's really who needs small, great things. I'm not telling people of color anything they don't know. But if you really want to know what it's like to be black in America, by all means, don't read me. You know, read the people who are living this every single day. Go pick up a copy of Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which will rip your heart out. I read that book in a day, and I went back to the bookstore and bought 10 copies and started passing them out to people because it moved me so deeply. You know, read Jacqueline Woodson, read Jessamine Ward, read Colson Whitehead, read Nicola Yoon, read Jason Reynolds. There are so many incredible authors of color who do a much better job, of course, than me at talking about their experiences.
I guess it's more timely than ever with the events of the last few weeks. How do we even go about trying to fix the mess that has just happened in America?
I haven't been back to America since the election. I was in Australia when it happened. I have never felt so isolated and alone in my life. A lot of people are still grieving and shocked. It is going to be a really hard 4 years in America. And we have seen already in 2 weeks such a rise of hate and entitlement. Not a surprise to me. Donald Trump rose to his candidacy by dividing our country, by targeting people, by creating stereotypes, by making hate mainstream, by allowing that to be right out in the open. And of course, in 2 weeks' time, we've seen things like swastikas painted on children's playgrounds. I have female friends who were groped on the subway of New York and by men who said, hey, our president does it, we can do it too. I know Muslim American families that have woken up with signs on their lawn saying, go home. I know of third graders, teachers who talk about third graders who are chanting to their Latino classmates, we're gonna build a wall and throw you over it. This is just the beginning. And we are about to see 4 years of freedoms being stripped away from a lot of different kinds of people in our country. I am a white woman. I might feel some of it, but the truth is I'm gonna be pretty protected. And so what I can hope for, the best I can hope for, is the fact that more than half my country did not want this man in power. That lead between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in the popular vote grows every single day. And a lot of those people who voted for Hillary Clinton are white people. And what I would like to believe is that as the voices are being systematically stripped away from people of color, from gay people, from women with reproductive rights, from Muslim Americans, I hope those white people will stand up and be those voices.
Thank you. So I think we'll open up 2 questions from the audience now. So if you have a question for Jodi, please raise your hand in the air and wait for the microphone to come around. It'd be really helpful if you stood up too so that we can see you. So, anyone has a question? If we go to the second row.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. One, I also know that in America there are many celebrities of color. So I was wondering if you also interviewed them for your book, and does the status of celebrity actually break everything that you mentioned and you become somebody else? And the second question, I'm from Russia, and you know, I'm from this country which has never experienced a problem of race, because we just, our history, like there are different people who are living maybe more of so basically do you think that being from such countries who don't have such problems, how to become aware of them from a distance, how to actually maybe, you know, we are racist but we don't know it because we just haven't experienced it.
Sure. So to answer your first question, there is a lot of literature and scientific sort of studies, as scientific as could be, that have been done on what happens with celebrity and race. And there is a tipping point. There is a point when you become such a celebrity that being a person of color doesn't matter anymore. Oprah is a great example of that. A lot of football players are great examples of that. You know, so I did not interview celebrities of color. I wasn't writing about celebrities of color. I was writing about ordinary people. Your second question is a really interesting one, because one of the interesting things about race is that it is almost inextricably twined with class in America. You cannot separate out the two. It's a little bit like Oh wait, I just used this example in Australia and everyone looked at me like I was crazy. You do know what a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is, right? Okay. I don't know why they don't know that in Australia. But if you put peanut butter and jelly on two different halves of your sandwich and then you open it back up again, you can't take the jelly and the peanut butter and separate them. They're all mixed up. That's kind of what race and class are like in America. Now, you live in a country that is predominantly white. I live in a state that is painfully white. But that doesn't mean that there isn't discrimination or that there isn't racism. I would go as far as to argue that the lessons that we can see in terms of racism in America could be very easily applied right here in the UK to people who are as white as the driven snow, but who weren't born in the UK right now. And that's a lot of what we're seeing in the wake of Brexit. You know, a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. I think discrimination changes depending on where you are. And I think you can adapt the lessons in this book and the lessons of what it means to be the person with power versus the the ones without power. It might be different in Russia, but I bet you could probably tell me who has the power in Russia, what group does, and what group doesn't. And that's the way you should look at the schism.
Thank you so much for your question. Really interesting. So if we come to with a red sleeve, there.
Hi. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to listen to you. I've been a big fan of your books since I was very young.
You're still
my
very
question, my question for you is, when I knew that you're coming to the Oxford Union, I Googled your bio and I realized that you did a master's in education.
I did.
And I have this assumption that you are using creative narratives for educational purposes in society, and I linked those two, and I would like to know your comment about that, and how can you use creative writing to advance knowledge and education?
Great question. Okay, I have to come to the Oxford Union more often because your questions are a lot more interesting than the general public. I'm just telling you now. I did get a master's in education. I went to a little school called Harvard, which is kind of like the Oxford of America. And I actually think that I do think of myself as a teacher. I just think that I have a much bigger classroom now. And here's the amazing thing about creative writing and fiction in particular. I'm writing a book right now, Small Great Things, is about a really tricky issue. If you walk up to someone on the street and say, let's have a talk about racism. How do you think that's gonna go? Not very well, right? But if you read a book with someone, if you watch a movie with someone, even someone who thinks differently than you do, you can start a conversation about fake characters and fake situations. Oh, when that happened to Ruth in the book, it really made me think of this. And actually, I saw something on the news the other day and it was blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, you can have a conversation with someone whose ideas might be very different from you, or someone who might put up a wall if you address this head on. That's what fiction and that's what creative arts allow you to do. It is a very gentle springboard into a very serious discussion. So I like to say that it's like a magic weapon, I mean, I can get people to talk about stuff that they would not ordinarily talk about. That, in a way, makes fiction, to me, much more powerful than nonfiction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your question. Do we have any more? There's a hand at the penultimate row on this side. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm from, thank you for being here. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
Hey.
It's weird to hear an American accent for the first time in 3 months.
Are you taking refuge in the UK too now?
Yeah, the application papers have been filed. Right. Kidding. First of all, what you were saying about a lot of white people, because they see themselves as not racist, they don't realize how bad problems are. As someone who's grown up in the South, been around some of the not so nice areas of the South as well as Atlanta.
Right.
That's dead on. I mean, the way you phrased it, though, I had never thought of it quite that way, but I will take that with me from here.
Oh, thank you.
And the question I have is a little bit off topic from that.
Sure.
It's a writing question.
Yeah.
When male writers write female characters, particularly female protagonists, what are the most common mistakes you see? Like, what are things you would say just just a checklist of what not to do,
Oh
essentially?
my gosh, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I know some men who write terrific female characters. And I would think that, you know, I would treat it like an other voice. I will actually tell you the opposite, because I'm not a guy, in case you haven't noticed. But I remember way back when I was writing my first book, I had to write a sex scene from a man's point of view. And I was like, well, this is going to be interesting. So I wrote this scene, and my husband came home from work. I was about 20,000 months pregnant with my first child, and it was the dead of summer, and I handed him the scene, and he came home. He was so hot and tired, and he had a long day at work. And I said, could you just read this? Can you tell me what you think of it? And he was like, oh God. He took the pages, and he went into our bedroom, and he's like stripping off his suit and getting comfortable. And he comes out about 10 minutes later, and he is bright red. And he goes, yeah, that's pretty good. Just like that. It was very, very funny. Right. You know, but honestly, the reason I'm telling you that story is because that's a sensitivity reader. And I had a couple of those ladies I did interviews with were my sensitivity readers. They read the book as a work in progress. They told me when Ruth's voice sounded authentic and when it did not. And more importantly, they told me how to fix it. And I couldn't have written this book without him. I wouldn't have written this book without them. I think if you have any questions when you are writing a woman, for God's sake, run it by a woman. You know, that's the easiest way to do it. God knows we're easy to find. So, you know, I think that's a really good way to listen to voice. I'm trying to think of like the biggest mistakes that I've seen. I guess I don't read that much bad fiction written by men in female voices because nothing is jumping to my head. But I mean, I have seen some really bad sex scenes from women's points of views written by men. I'm not even going to touch that one with a 10-foot pole, though. I think the biggest thing that I see, and this is an old sort of theme, is that when women tell you something that's upsetting them, what they're looking for is someone to say, oh my God, you're right, that must be so awful. And a lot of times what men do is just say, well, then you need to do this, and this, and this. And you're like, shut up, that's not the point. You know, so I would be sensitive to those things, to the ways that kind of women's brains work. And sometimes what you need is the ear and not the solution. Because I've seen that mistake sometimes in fiction too. That's the best I can offer. But a well-written character is a well-written character.
Wonderful, thank you so much for your question. I think we have a hand right at the very back stood up.
Hi, so I'm also American, and I had a question as a person of color, because you've been talking a lot about how white allies are typically the ones who should be speaking to other white people about issues of race, but I'm wondering where you think people of color fit in, because if we're sort of talking about our own struggles, are we supposed to find white allies to speak to spread our message, or how are we supposed to get it out there to other people?
So it's a great question, and I would turn back to, like again, I'm not a racial justice educator, so I'm just telling you what I've learned. Beverly Daniel Tatum is a brilliant racial justice educator. She's the former president of Spelman College, actually, in Atlanta. And she has a great book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And it's about the idea of same safe spaces. So there's definitely a world in which people of color need their own communities with no white folks around. And white people should be with white folks with no people of color around. I even asked her a question about that. I was like, wait, isn't that gonna lead to a rise of white supremacy? And she's like, no, what it's gonna lead to a rise of is honest discussion without paralysis by fear. So it's important to talk about race with your own groups. But you're right, what white people can do right now that people of color can't seem to do as easily is attract attention. And you know, the best way I can describe this is to make a parallel to the gay rights movement, okay? When we had terrific leaders in the gay community who spoke up, when we had Democratic congressmen who spoke up for gay rights, everyone yawned. It took a few Republican congressmen and senators who were very conservative and very religious and very evangelical to say, you know what, we really should have gay marriage, before people started to listen. And I don't really know why that is. That's a weird dynamic that I hate. But in a way, if white people and people of color can work together to bridge the gap, I think the best way is, it's twofold. White people should go into communities of color and not say, I'm here to help you and I'm going to tell you what to do. White people should go into communities of color and say, hi, do you need my help? You do? Great. What can I do for you? And take the lead from someone of color. But white people are really good at getting attention. And they're really good at getting microphones stuffed in front of their faces. And what the job of the white ally is to do is to take the microphone and go, is everybody listening? Great. And pass it to someone else to amplify the voice of someone of color who may not have been heard yet. That's, I think, what we need to see more of. I had a hilarious episode I was doing a talk in the US, and this really cool woman, an African-American woman, stood up. She was hilarious, and she was saying, I read your book. I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I saw myself all over this book, and all I wanted to do was talk to a white person about it, but I couldn't figure out where to find one. And I started laughing. I said, well, we're very, very, inconspicuous. I understand that. And, and I understand that need too, that desire to have an honest conversation with someone who's different from you. So I recommend putting yourself into places where your face isn't the predominant color. And maybe it's a book club. Maybe you start a book club with a few friends who can spread the word so that you can start to have these conversations, or a film club, or even just a dinner. All of those ways are tiny little bridges. We're two different communities that need each other to make a difference. But we have to figure out, how can we best help each other in this? And right now, I would argue the balance is really skewed. White people, groups of white people, need to do more helping. And groups of color really just need a path to a podium. Does that answer your question?
Wonderful, thank you so much for that. If we come to you in the grey scarf, yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. 2 questions. One, I just was wondering your author influences specifically. I mean, when I think of the type of writing that you write, although it's more sci-fi based, I mean, Octavia Butler comes to mind,
right.
A classic that I teach
Sure.
my students. But are there authors like that, women of color or not, that you're influenced by for your writing? And then also, you had said in a prior kind of like interview that a book that you thought needed to be written was a book of the religious divide in the United States and like within America. And I was wondering, if you could feel yourself one day writing that, and if not, why do you think it's so important that's
So I already wrote that book. That's the good news. So Keeping Faith was part of that book. Sing You Home was very much about that as well. When it comes to authors of color who inspire me, there are a lot. I mean, I think Jesmyn Ward is a beautiful storyteller. And Nicola Yoon is the best YA author out there right now. She's a woman of color. And I am currently in the middle of reading a debut novel by Britt Bennett called The Mothers, which is phenomenal. I can't believe, she's like 20 years old. I can't believe this woman's 20 years old. And of course, then you go back to the old standards. When I was in college, I was influenced by Toni Morrison. I saw her read from Beloved as a work in progress. It was unbelievable. I mean, it was a group of students like you guys, and we were all sitting there listening to her, and you could have heard a pin drop. It was incredible. Gloria Naylor was someone I read a lot of. Jamaica Kincaid, when I was a student as well. I tend to look now for contemporary authors of color, but it's something I've been saying a lot of. One of the great ways to see where you are in terms of implicit bias is to look at your bookshelf. Are you reading an author of color for every white author? And if you're not, why not? If you only read people who look and sound like you, then you're never gonna grow. So definitely go out and find, there are so many out there. It's ridiculous. Colson Whitehead's book, The Underground Railroad, left me in a stupor for about a week. It was so good, so good. I was so glad he won the National Book Award.
Wonderful, thank you so much for your question. We've got time for a couple more. Jodi has to shoot off at 1:45. If we come to you...
This lady over here with the orange zipper,
sure.
She's been very passionate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming. Funny enough, I'm also from Atlanta, and I attend Emory University and major in creative writing.
What are you doing here?
I'm a visiting student here.
Oh, okay.
And
All right,
yeah.
great.
So like
Emory's a great school for creative writing. Good for you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering about like your own writing experience. What made you choose to major in writing in Princeton University?
Yep.
To start off with, because I know that despite the fact that my school has a really good creative writing program, a lot of students, they will just go off and choose to be a medic or to be a pre-business just for the sake of future jobs. They're like, oh, Zoe, what are you doing? I'm majoring in creative writing. You're not going to have any jobs. So like, I was wondering, what
Also true, right?
Yeah.
Yes, right.
What are some of the advice you would give to like undergrads like us? And have you ever encountered any writing obstacles, and how did you overcome them?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
So I did go to Princeton as an undergrad, and I did major in creative writing. I went there specifically because when I went to college in the 1980s, there were not many schools that had undergraduate creative writing programs. And I really wanted to work with living, breathing writers. And I did. I worked almost exclusively with a woman named Mary Morris, who 100% taught me everything I know. I would not be here if not for her. And I'm going to tell you about my first experience in a creative writing class. I walked in there thinking I was an excellent writer. And Mary made me, it was a workshop, so she made me sit on the floor with students surrounding me. She gave me construction paper, scissors, and a glue stick. And she said, don't talk, just listen and do what they say. And then she said, where does Jodi's story really start? And someone went, page 3. And she goes, yeah, right. Threw first 2 pages behind her. She made me cut and paste that entire story and not say a word for the entire class. I left there so upset, cried all night, went back to her office hours the next day. And I said, why did you do that to me? And she said, because you need it and because you can take it. I was so mad at her that I edited that story and edited it and edited it. And finally she said to me, why don't you send it somewhere? And I said, what do you mean? I'm writing this for a class. She said, go send it to 17 magazine, which is like a teen magazine in the US. So I did, sent it to 17. A couple of months later, I had a phone call on my answering machine, back when we had dorm phones. And they said, we'd like to pay you for your short story. And I was like, wait, really? Because I would pay you. I was shocked. And I called my mom up and I said, I'm going to be a writer. And she said, oh, that's so great. Who's going to support you? So I graduated with a degree in creative writing, but I did not become a writer. I actually went to go work on Wall Street, which was very strange because I can't balance my checkbook. But they were looking for someone who could write well. They wanted someone to write these giant 300-page documents that were given to bond rating companies about different clients. So at one point, I wrote 300 pages about fiat. You can imagine how exciting that was. And then the stock market crashed. I was so happy because I knew they would fire me. And I did. I took my severance pay and I moved to Massachusetts where the guy I was dating was living. It was a good call. I married him. But I had a series of jobs over 2 years that were not writing. I was a textbook publishing editor. I was an advertising copywriter. I taught creative writing at a private school. I got that master's in education. I taught 8th grade English at a public school. I got married, I got pregnant, all in 2 years' time, because I'm a very big underachiever, as you can see. And I basically was writing that whole time because I can't not write. So when I was a textbook publishing editor, I used to finish all my work by 10 in the morning. I would close my door, pretend I was so busy, and instead I was writing my novel. And I think if you're a writer, you already know it. You can't not write. I would be a writer even if I wasn't a published author, and those are 2 different things. But I used those 2 years as well to get an agent. She has been my agent now for 25 years. And she's the one who sold the first book that I wrote outside of college. She sold that in about 3 months' time, and that became my first novel. And I've long said that the reason I kept writing is because it's easier than teaching 8th grade English. But the truth is, I'm very lucky to be able to do what I love. That said, I didn't contribute to my family income in any great way until probably about 7 years ago. Writing is not a lucrative career. We are not all John Grisham. And at this point, I do make a great amount of money with my books. That's not the norm. I am very, very fortunate, but it also wasn't an overnight success. It was word of mouth. It was writing a book and then having people say, oh, you got to read this. And then having them say that to their friends. That is the one kind of advertising you cannot buy. And what I would urge you to do if you're a writer is to write and write with realism. It's not going to help you if you starve. But you can write and do something else. And most writers do that. Most writers also teach or wait tables or have some other job. I know a guy who was a full-time lawyer who got up 2 hours earlier just so he could write a novel and then got it published. And if you need to write, you will find a way to write. Just do it in a way so that you will not starve at the same time.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for, as Jodi does have to dash off to another engagement. There will be signed copies of her book to purchase afterwards. But please, everyone join me in thanking Jodi Picoult.
Thank you so much.